Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads. And today my guest, once again, is Lindsay Beyerstein. Lindsay, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Lindsay Beyerstein, and I am an investigative journalist in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the co-host of the podcast and radio show Point of Inquiry, produced by the Center for Inquiry, and I'm a huge Serial fan.
Great. So we're going to be talking about the final episode of Serial, which came out today, Thursday, December 18th. And for people who don't know what Serial is or aren't aware of it, listen to the previous conversation that we had, Lindsay and I had. It will be linked below the video. That'll explain everything about Serial. And we're just going to really jump right in. But I also say, if you aren't listening to Serial, what's wrong with you? You have to listen to it. It's completely done now. So you can start at the beginning. You have to start at episode 1, serialpodcast.org. Check it out. And let's jump right in.
Just take tomorrow off work and binge listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, I love that there's this new phrase, binge watching came through Netflix and DVDs, and now we have binge listen, which actually my mother said to me was the first time I heard it. So obviously this phrase is going to be a new thing, and maybe some Blogging Heads fans are binge listening to the Blogging Heads backlog, but this revolution in the forum has created new terms. So the final episode, which is called What We Know, I think, came out today. And what did you think?
I thought it was it ended pretty much the way I expected. I mean, people kept asking me, how is this going to end? Is there going to be a big twist? And I kept saying, well, I don't think so, because real life doesn't necessarily order up big twists, and this was an ongoing investigation. I've always believed them when they said that. And my impression overall was it was emotionally effective, and it was very intellectually honest.
Yeah, I thought so too. I thought the ending was as satisfying as it could have been. We talked last time about how ending this podcast in a way that would make everyone happy would be very difficult. This is real life, not fiction. Loose ends were not necessarily going to be wrapped up, and a definitive statement wasn't necessarily going to be produced. And that's kind of where we ended up. It was also kind of ended up where I thought it would, but I kind of thought that they might introduce a recorded interview with someone who we haven't heard from before, like Stephanie or Jen. Stephanie would be Jay's girlfriend at the time, and Jen would be Stephanie's friend, Jay's friend, who who was one of the first people, I think, who went to the cops before Jay did. But we didn't get that. Instead, we heard from Don. We didn't actually hear from him because he didn't want to be recorded, but we heard quotes from Sarah Koenig's interview with him. This is Don, Hayes' boyfriend at the time of the murder. And something that actually revealed that they didn't really say before is that they were only dating for 2 weeks when Hay disappeared, which was kind of surprising. But you kind of hear from Don, you see that, Don has a pretty solid alibi, and he also talks about Adnan and his impressions of Adnan, and it's kind of what we've heard from other people talking about Adnan when he was in high school. Seemed like a really nice guy, never would have thought he'd be involved in something like this. But what we did, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, the other thing that I thought was interesting about the Dawn interview was that there was a mistake in the trial, where they had Dawn testify about meeting Adnan in the parking lot when they both came to see if Hayes' car was all right, because she was having car trouble in the snow. And Hayes' diary said it was December 23rd or something like that, before Hay and Dawn had started dating. But the trial made it seem like it was after they started dating. So people made a big deal about, Dawn and Adnan were so pleasant to each other. And it never really seemed like that big of a deal one way or the other in terms of evidence, but especially the fact that this conversation that everyone's made so much of, the fact that it happened before Hay and Dawn even started dating, so Adnan had no reason to be suspicious.
Right, and the other really interesting thing from Don's interview was that apparently the prosecution, he testified to both trials, the prosecution was not happy with how his testimony was going, and he said that the prosecutor literally yelled at him both times, because he wasn't basically sticking to the story that the prosecution presented. And I think at this point, it's fair to say that it's hard to listen to this whole podcast and still believe that what the prosecution said happened actually happened. That seems plainly false. They did not, what actually happened is still kind of up in the air, but what the prosecution's case was not true.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I think I think that basically what happened was the cell evidence was very difficult to corroborate against Jay's testimony. And I think that was kind of an interesting kind of garbage in, garbage out, that people would look at Jay's first interview and his second interview and catalog all the discrepancies. And I feel like that's kind of it was kind of an unrealistic expectation. Everyone said, we're so sure that Jay is such a huge liar. And don't get me wrong, Jay does have some actual, reputation in his former life as being, a fabricator and various other things. But you think about it, it's 6 weeks after the fact, remembering a day when you were extremely upset and high, and there were 34 calls in the call log, and the police wanted Jay to reconstruct every twist and turn of his day and exactly what time it was. Mm-hmm. And they made him do it first without the call log, and then they made him do it again 2 weeks later with the call log. And it's like, well, of course the first one is not going to be perfect, because how well does anybody, I actually did this as a little experiment for myself, was I just picked a day 6 weeks earlier than the day of the experiment and just said, okay, what was I doing on November 28th?
Oh, that's interesting.
And I wrote down a little, what I could remember of November 28th, which was essentially nothing. Then I started adding more and more of my own cell phone, email, Twitter, and my recollection.
All things except for cell phones, things that did not exist in 1999. Exactly. Email existed, but these kids didn't seem to have email. They had cell phones and pagers.
Well, Adnan did have email, but so just but
no emails were entered in, at least described in the show, and people weren't posting what they were doing on Facebook, and so there was some digital information, the cell phone records, which were very contested, but much less than we have today.
Right. So I'm going back and comparing what I remembered to what the objective record is, which was a lot better today than it is then, and just seeing how my recollection changed. And it was funny because in my coulda, woulda, probably, my recollection of it was that I was probably home all day because I knew my boyfriend was away on doing an assignment in Copenhagen, and I was home by myself, and it was like a lot of the other days in that 6 week period where I was just at home working. But then when I finally got to my bank records, it turns out there was a bar tab there. And if somebody had questioned me the first time, I would have said I was home all night, and then if they'd come back to me with this bar record, they would have said I was a liar.
Right. So one of the themes that this show has definitely highlighted, and that social science researchers have discovered in recent years, is eyewitness testimony and memory is much less reliable than we think and is popularly understood. There's creating an implanted memory unintentionally is very easy. If you kind of think that you remember something, you kind of end up remembering the last time you told it to someone, not the original time it actually happened. So that's how these kind of false memories can kind of snowball in your mind. You can the more times you say it, you explain what actually happened to someone. If it wasn't totally accurate, it becomes more sure in your mind that the story was true, and you're less accurate about what really happened. So, and Adnan says he doesn't remember a lot of details from that day, which for him seemed like, he claims at least, was an ordinary day. So, but of course, in trials, the eyewitness testimony is the thing that juries seem to be most sure about and say, oh, I believed him, he was telling the truth. Yeah. When even if the person believes they're telling the truth, it might not be accurate.
And also there's this sort of question of the fine line between jogging someone's memory and implanting memories for them. So Jay gives a story, and then they give him the cell phone records, and like, oh yeah, I remember that, which is what happened to me in my experiment. It was like, oh yeah, I totally remember going to that bar with Amanda. I didn't realize it was the 28th of October, but oh yeah, I do remember doing that now. And of course, I'll never know the extent to which that's a fabricated memory that's just brought on by the fact that I have a bar tab there, or whether they authentically did jog my memory and change the story of the day because it's helping me retrieve a memory trace that's actually in my brain. Right.
So let's talk about where Sarah Koenig ends, where she leaves it. The Innocence Project is still investigating. Obviously, the story, while Serial season 1 has ended, the story of Adnan's guilt, still lives on. But she basically says if she was on the jury, she would have voted not to convict. And I think any reasonable person listening to this whole series would have to say there is reasonable doubt. I don't know how you could listen to this whole thing and think, I'm 100% sure. There's so much reasonable doubt. So it seems like there was a miscarriage of justice because, of course, in the American justice system, we like to say we'd rather have 10 guilty people go free than one innocent person go to jail. And Dick Cheney doesn't agree with this. but that seems like the best way to operate things. And so she says she wouldn't have voted to convict. She says she's not 100% sure, but she's pretty sure that Adnan did not do it. But we just don't have all the facts. And she's so dogged, and she's been tracking down the facts. And she really ends it with where kind of I was thinking, which is that the only fact that we are 100% sure of is that Jay knew where Hayes' car was.
And also we found out from some outside the podcast documents that he was able to take them to the burial site.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, that wasn't as big news, and I think the reason that they didn't feature it was because that had already been announced. But, I mean, he was actually able to go to this, for what I got from reading this very short description in an appeal or something like that, was that he was actually able to take them to the exact part of Lincoln Park where the body was. And as we've seen in those charts of bodies in Lincoln Park, that's not an easy task to do. There are like 68 different places where people have hidden bodies in Lincoln Park. And Jay was able to say, well, no, we went to the one with the concrete divider on the highway, and we were able to pull over, and Adnan walked into the woods by the tree and everything like that. So he did have...
Okay, so that's interesting. So the only thing we know for sure is that Jay is involved somehow. Yeah. That's the only thing I think everyone can agree on just based on the facts.
Yeah.
Jay has to be involved somehow. Everything else is up for grabs. So what did you think of how Sarah Koenig left it? And would you last time we talked, you said you were pretty sure, if you had to place a bet, you were pretty sure that Adnan did do it. Do you still believe that?
I still think that, but if I had been on a jury, I mean, the reasonable doubt is the standard, and I think that they raised enough things based on sort of the contradictions in Jay's story and all kinds of other stuff, the unreliability of certain aspects of the cell phone record, the fact that it didn't really match Jay's story or Adnan's story in certain ways. I mean, there was what might have been a trip to Endicott City in the morning and somewhere in Baltimore near Edmondson Avenue that they may have both been on together that morning instead of shopping, like Jay says. So it's, I think that there's definitely reasonable doubt. And so I would have had to vote to acquit, but reasonable doubt, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is an amazing standard. It's a really good thing that we have it in our system, but it's a very high standard. I mean, there's virtually nothing I believe beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, so if you say that, you probably wouldn't be allowed to be a member of a murder case jury pool.
I've been rejected from the jury pool once before. I was kind of disappointed. I didn't even get to the inner room where they question you.
Oh yeah, I've actually never been called. The one time I got a jury summons, it was canceled the day of, so I've never even went. But it does seem like a fascinating thing to do, and I hope one day to be able to do it and hopefully do a good job. But okay, so we both agree he should not have been convicted beyond a reasonable doubt.
I'm not even sure this case should have gone to trial based on the evidence that they have.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the evidence seems pretty weak. And what would you agree that what the prosecution argued happened did not happen?
I would say that it depends on like what broad strokes. I think the most likely explanation is that Adnan probably did manage to sneak into Hayes' car, and that he probably did get Jay to help him dispose of the body. But in terms of Jay's blow-by-blow, sort of path throughout the day, most of that is not corroborable. And I think that, Jay is probably lying about where he was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's the time he believes that Adnan was killing Hayes. So he and Jen are probably covering for each other. And a lot of stuff he probably just doesn't remember. But, I mean, I tend to believe that he's telling the truth about how Adnan says, showed him the body in the trunk and wanted him to help Adnan dispose of the body. And what was I going to say about that? Oh,
so what about Jay's story changing between interviews about where, like, at one point, this much better than I do. I think in the first interview he says something like on Edmondson Avenue. Yeah,
in the trunk,
trunk pop,
the trunk pop, and then the Best Buy parking lot, and all this stuff.
Yeah, the Best Buy. So Jay's story, these details are changing. What do you think about that?
Well, as they pointed out in the podcast, we don't know what happened in these pre-interviews each time or what the police is going theory. I mean, I sort of feel like it's almost tragic. It's an illustration of why we need police to have sound interview techniques that don't distort people's memories, because you can be as tough on crime as you want, but if the police are going around impressing witnesses with their own biases, intentionally or unintentionally, they could be spoiling the only witness that actually even remotely knows what happened. And it could be a case where Jay would have been a really credible witness he probably still would have lied about, where he was around 3 o'clock, and he probably would have, had certain things that he was deliberately lying about. But I think a lot of the changes in his story came from the fact that he was kind of guesstimating, and the police were standing there trying to impress on him their understanding of what the cell record meant, which probably was not that accurate to begin with. So you've got these cops leaning on this kid who, of course, doesn't have a lawyer. That's always a big problem. So if he'd had a lawyer and someone looking out for his interests that had been able to be there for him, I think we probably would have actually paradoxically gotten a more reliable story out of him than just him being this feather in the wind of whatever the cops who have the power of life and death over him, as far as he knows. I mean, he could be a conspirator to first-degree murder. In fact, that's what his own statement implicated him as being. People are always saying, well, why would Jay help Adnan? It wasn't the pot dealing. It's like, no, it probably wasn't the pot dealing, but here's what I do think it was. From his very first statement, and he never wavered on this, Jay said that Adnan said, I'm going to go kill Hay, come pick me up afterwards. And that makes him, and he's like, yeah, man, okay. And he may not have believed it 100%. Adnan might have not even believed it 100% himself when he said it. I mean, people sometimes throw around all kinds of ideas and then don't follow through on them. But given that he said this and there's this whole arrangement with the car and the phone that anybody was going to be able to check, suddenly Jay's a conspirator to first-degree murder. And that's a reason to hide the body right there.
Okay, so you think Jay was not involved beyond helping cover up, basically?
I don't know. I mean, there are ways that you can sort of interpret the evidence that he may have been involved, but I really just can't see any way. And, I mean, but if Adnan has a weak motive, Jay has an even weaker motive. I mean, he didn't even really know Hay. People had these theories about, oh, well, maybe Hay confronted him about the fact that, Jay was cheating on Stephanie, but this seemed to be a theory that originated almost entirely with Adnan talking to his defense attorney in October of that year when he'd been sitting in jail for a while and was kind of brainstorming about what possible connection Hay and Jay might have. A childhood friend or high school friend of Adnan's who's involved in his defense said that Adnan told him back before, while Adnan and Hay were still dating, that Jay was cheating on Stephanie and Hay was mad about it. So maybe it wasn't something that originated completely with Adnan, but then it still raises the question, is that even plausible? Like, why would Hay care? Stephanie wasn't her best friend. And also there are all these logistical problems as to how if Jay was acting alone, he's going to be able to know where Hay is and follow her and get into her car, because Hay's leaving Woodlawn High School at 3 o'clock going to pick up her cousins. But would Jay know that? Adnan might know that. Probably would know that because it's something she did all the time and they dated. Would Jay know where she was going? Would Jay have been in the parking lot at 3 o'clock in order to follow her? Was it plausible that if he did follow her, he could get her somewhere where he could actually strangle her? Would she go somewhere with him? All those things don't make sense to me, and it makes more sense that the teacher who testified that Hay didn't have anyone in her car may have been mistaken. I mean, people have said, well, it was the snack lineup outside the gym, and it was always a mob scene. And sorry, my computer just went to sleep here. So she's sort of looking out the window at Hay leaving, and she doesn't notice anybody sitting in Hay's car. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she wasn't particularly paying riveting attention. She wasn't expecting to see anybody in Hay's car. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's possible that she was just wrong. I mean, I'm sure she's a sincere and caring teacher and attuned to her students and everything. But the main eyewitness, the only eyewitness evidence that Hay drove off alone comes from her, and I'm not sure she was in the best vantage point to be able to definitively rule out that anyone was in the car.
Okay, so you think that they made a big deal out of this whole thing, whether or not Adnan asked her for a ride or not. It seems like the producers came down that they thought he did ask her for a ride. So you think that he did ask for a ride and drove off with her, and that's when he committed the murder? I think that's
that's my going theory. And again, that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's just a theory, but I think it's the most likely one.
Okay. Well, I mean, once again,
he definitely did ask for her. Well, I think that I'm thoroughly convinced that he asked and then he lied about it or misremembered what he said to the police. So there were two different people that came forward at the time to say, yes, he asked her for a ride. And one of the people who did said he asked her for a ride for a reason that I think is pretty clearly false, which is misleading, which is that his car, he needed a ride to go get his car. And of course, he knew that his car was with Jay, and there's no reason why he would need, and he had an agreement that Jay would come and get him whenever he asked. And he also was going to track, so it's not entirely clear why. I mean, he might want to leave campus, but what was he leaving campus for? Nobody's ever really been able to say. And how's he going to get back if he is asking Hay for a ride somewhere in time for track practice? So the whole thing made me feel like he was he was lying to Hay. And to me, that was a big deal, was the fact that it seemed inexplicable that he would do this, and it seemed like he was lying to Hay, and he could have been lying to the police, because he said the first time, "No, I didn't ask her for a ride," and then when he was asked again, he said, "No, I didn't ask her because I drive," or he said yes first and no afterwards because I drive my own car to school, or something like that.
Okay, so once again, you are a much bigger serial superfan than me, so I defer to you on all these facts that you have much better command over. I'll just say that I think I agree that it's hard to come up with a motive for why Jay did it, but well, actually, let's go to something that lots of different people online who are lawyers or just kind of amateur sleuths. We discussed this last time. Have written about the show, and one in particular, a blog called "The View from LL2," written by a lawyer. She did a very extensive examination of multiple aspects of the case, and it's kind of anyone who's interested in the show should check this out. It's
really
a little,
great
I mean.
blog.
Yeah, it's she does a very good job, and it's kind of like what would have happened if Adnan had a really good defense attorney, or a defense attorney who presented a really good case for him. And so I just want to read something that she wrote that really kind of changed how I thought about this. So she writes, while it is true that one witness's fabricated testimony cannot be used to prove Adnan's innocence, by the same token, the fabricated testimony cannot be used to prove Adnan's guilt either. Because once you agree that Jay's story is unreliable, inconsistent, and manufactured, then the only way to conclude that Adnan is guilty is to discard everything in Jay's statements that is inconsistent with the theory that Adnan and Jay worked together to kill Hay, which is a lot of things to discard, and to also assume the existence of a whole host of additional facts that were not contained in Jay's testimony or anywhere else. But once your theory of the case is based on accepting only those parts of Jay's testimony that are consistent with Adnan's guilt, and by speculating about the existence of additional sets of facts which Jay has never testified, well, how is that any different from simply writing a piece of fiction? By using that approach to Jay's testimony, it is possible to invent a narrative that supports the guilt of just about any individual connected to Woodlawn. So what would your response to that be?
My response to that is it's largely true. I mean, if you don't know what to believe about Jay's testimony, and legally Jay's testimony is the linchpin of the state's case, which it is, I mean, that's reasonable doubt. So, I mean, that is certainly true. I still think if you're thinking about what's more likely rather than what can you prove, that
Right.
It makes more sense to say, which is a more plausible hypothesis, that Jay is, the basic spine of Jay's testimony is true, and that he's lying about certain things or doesn't know about certain things that I wouldn't, frankly, expect him to remember from first principles anyway, or that he's been pressured in some way. I still think that's the more likely scenario.
Okay, so that's interesting. So we have two different kind of burdens here. So the lawyer's burden is reasonable doubt, and then the regular person's burden is what actually happened. So I think the way that the view from LL2 is arguing is that from the lawyer's perspective, Jay's testimony is worthless,
Right?
Because we know that Jay is a liar. I mean that's obvious that he lies. I mean he admits that he lies, and there's multiple times where the cops are interrogating him, and they said, so you weren't telling us the truth in the previous interrogation, and he says, no, I was scared.
Yeah.
And that's a natural. I mean, if we consider that Jay is telling the truth, it's natural to lie. Obviously, he's scared out of his mind. He could be, an accessory after the fact to murder, and he could be looking at 20 years or whatever.
Or even a co-conspirator to murder. He could be just as on the hook as Adnan. He knew it was going to happen, and he agreed to drive the getaway car afterwards. So. Right.
So lying. If we believe that Jay's not the killer, then but was involved, then we have to believe he was involved in some way because he knew where the car was and where he was buried. Then lying to protect himself is a kind of a normal human response. But at the same time, kind of picking and choosing. Oh, it seems like Jay's telling the truth here because it hurts Adnan's case, but he can't be expected to tell the truth here because that would make him look bad. It's kind of a weird way to be looking at it, and Jay is a liar, so why should we trust him at all?
Well, I mean, I think that the reason that we should trust him is his story basically makes more sense than any. I don't see how Jay could have done it himself. I mean, Jay was clearly involved, and I don't see any plausible way that Jay could have done it on his own without help from Adnan if he didn't know where he was,
or help from someone else.
Okay,
I mean,
that's
the other thing, right?
But I mean,
and Adnan is the obvious suspect because he's the ex-boyfriend. But again, the only thing. There's no actual piece of evidence tying him to it that's separate from Jay.
Right. But I mean, I just think that there's no way. If you think about Jay doing it on his own with no help, I just don't see that he has a motive, and I don't see that he has a plausible way to execute the crime. I mean, to me, that's even more important than a motive, because lots of motives are unsatisfactory or inexplicable when you look back at them. I mean, what could possibly be a good reason to kill a 17-year-old girl with your bare hands? But
obviously, there's no.
But I just don't
motive.
see any. I just don't see any way that any plausible way that Jay could have gotten into Hayes' car and strangled her after school when he didn't know where she was going.
Okay. Yeah, that
and
makes
even
sense.
if he did know where she was going, it doesn't really seem to make sense that he could get her to pull over or get her to let him into her car. I mean, it just seems so much more likely that if it was that Adnan must have had some kind of role in it, because it does seem plausible that he could have gotten into Hayes' car.
Right. Well, let's discuss something else that was brought up for the first time in this final episode, which is another possible perpetrator revealed by the investigators at the Innocence Project. I think they said his name was Ronald Lee Moore.
Yeah.
You can help me fill in the details, but this was someone who was convicted of burglary, rape, and murder, was out of jail during the time. I think they said it had been released January 1st, and the murder happened on the 13th of January. This is someone who is no longer alive. And this is also someone who has been connected via DNA evidence to another victim in Baltimore County who is a Asian American male. Asian American female? Sorry. Is that all correct?
Yeah, that's all right.
Right. So I mean, again, this is if this was a work of fiction, the serial killer aspect or serial rapist, we could point to it. In real life, it seems unlikely, and yet there are people like this. There are cold cases. One has been linked via DNA evidence, and there's some kind of fantastical theorizing you can do when we know that Jay is connected to the crime somehow. We have this new introduction of this figure, Ronald Lee Moore. Is it somehow possible that Jay has a connection to Ronald Lee Moore? Ronald Lee Moore commits the crime. Maybe he's flags Hay down while she's driving with his thumb up on the side of the road. He commits the crime, and through a strange coincidence, he has a connection to Jay. Jay helps him dispose of the body, and then Jay is very afraid because this guy is a serial murderer, and so Jay fingers Adnan. Does that? I mean, it just seems. I agree that I admit that this is wildly implausible, but it makes a certain kind of sense. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think there's no evidence that Jay had any connection to Ronald Lee Moore, and Serial certainly had ample time to check to see if there was any. And again, why would Jay particularly help this guy or even know that he was a serial murderer? I mean, he was out of jail.
Right. So there's facts. Obviously, we don't know that, and we never heard from Jay on audio. But I don't know. I think that they're gonna. So DNA. So there's been a request by the Innocence Project to test the untested evidence kit. It's possible that this will come up with something, but that's still out there. I don't know. Honestly, even though that sounds totally crazy and like something out of fiction, it somehow seems more like a more likely thing than
the other problem
Adnan conspired with Jay to do it.
With that theory is why did Jen and Jay fold so quickly when they saw Adnan's cell phone record? I mean, there's nothing in the cell phone record that links them to the person who actually did it. And if they knew, oh yeah, we were off conspiring with the serial murderer, they could have just said nothing. They could have just bluffed their way through it, but they freaked out when those cell phone records came to light.
Well, if we accept that Jay did have Adnan's phone for the reason that Adnan says, so that because Jay had the car, so he can get the present, and then so he could keep in touch, and then Jay has the phone, and he actually is the accomplice to this.
But none of the calls
newly introduced person.
None of the calls seem to implicate the newly introduced person. So it's like a totally different theory of the crime. So Adnan's cell phone would just have been a red herring. I don't know why they would have been so scared about it.
Well, if Adnan, who everyone agrees was a upstanding young man, testifies that he gave his cell phone to Jay, and Jay was actually carrying it around all day, and Jay helped this third party cover up the crime, then who are they going to believe? Jay, the admitted drug dealer, or Adnan, the upstanding young man?
But there's nothing in the phone record particularly that would suggest involvement with the third person. And the phone record doesn't really seem to place Jay anywhere. I mean, the sort of part of the meat of the idea that Jay might have some connection to this guy is because this guy lived, near Hayes' house in the Campfield Early Learning Center, and he had some connection to Woodlawn High School. It's just like, well, but the phone record didn't show that Jay had been anywhere near the Campfield Early Learning Center either. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the things that makes this case so absorbing is that the facts don't line up easily for any possible explanation. I honestly, even though it sounds crazy and it sounds like something out of fiction, I would say that's more likely than that Adnan did it. But why don't we actually move on to something that I mentioned last time and was kind of a, there's this famous saying about Chekhov's gun. If Chekhov supposedly said, if there's a gun hanging on the wall in the first act, it needs to go off in the third act. So, and that's related to how fiction works and storytelling, and how we want resolution and stuff, and you can't introduce a red herring, or if you do, you need to explain it away. So I think the only thing I would criticize in this final episode is that they never went back to these audio clips that were played in the first episode that I mentioned in our last conversation, one of which was speculating, and of course we don't know who's actually saying these things. We recognize Sarah Koenig's voice, but the other ones, we don't know who are saying them. Someone saying something to the effect of, you saw what happened to Hay, do you want it to happen to you? Someone else saying, well, we're running out of suspects. Someone possibly, it sounded like it was Sarah and her producer Dana saying, what if he just snapped? And they never went back and played these. So that was kind of disappointing. But I have a theory about possibly why, and what do you think?
I don't really have a theory about the other two. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember those as not being followed up on. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they certainly did consider the possibility that Adnan just snapped in the second to last episode where they talked to the forensic psychologist. So I consider that one to have been redeemed, even though I don't remember that clip showing up again or not in the next episode. The only one that I'm sure was never followed up on and that I have a problem with journalistically is the one where this unidentified female voice is saying, and he's threatening me, and he's like, what happened to Hay could happen to you. Right. And to me, that's just the most provocative clip in the entire series. Mm-hmm. And not just in terms of storytelling, but in terms of journalism. If it wasn't strong, why did they put it in the teaser? And I'm not going to hold it against them. It's an open-ended investigation. I know from my own investigation, sometimes things that seem like total sure things do not pan out. And maybe you've teased something that you can't make good on. Maybe this had something to do with the giant rumor, the one where Sarah Koenig said, there's this giant rumor about the horribleness of Adnan, and if it's true, we can all go home. And she was completely unable to confirm it. So I would have just liked to have seen them acknowledge the fact that they couldn't go any further with this. Even if they couldn't have said any more than, we showed you this, but it was one of the many leads that didn't pan out, and it went in a different way than we were expecting. And we can't really talk about why, even, because maybe it's tied up in some people have speculated that has something to do with Adnan's future appeals, or that they could say, this was part of the rumor that we don't talk about because it's so prejudicial against Adnan and we were never able to confirm it. I mean, any of those things would have been fine. I don't think that they have to necessarily even give us a blow-by-blow of what it was and where they got it. They can just say, oh yeah, this is a thing we're not going any further with because we can't.
Yeah, and it's kind of surprising they didn't, because they've been so open and so transparent. And when you're reading a long piece of narrative nonfiction, you don't hear about the rumor. The author never tells you, "Oh, we spent months tracking down this rumor and it didn't pan out, so we can't tell you about it." That never happened. So there's this is really radical transparency, but they didn't explain this. So so here's my theory, and tell me if this is crazy. Okay. So one of the theories that this final episode would be an not on camera, an on microphone interview with either Jen or Stephanie. So I think that voice was either Jen or Stephanie, and I think Sarah Koenig did do an interview with them, but what they said would have libeled Jay. So Sarah Koenig never accuses Jay, and she really leaves it out there for the audience to interpret. But there are libel laws, and saying, I believe this real person murdered someone and was never charged, that someone could sue you for that. So they don't want to do that. And I think whoever they interviewed that had that clip was so explosive and would have basically laid the murder charge at Jay's feet, they decided, but they couldn't back it up. They didn't have enough to back it up, so they decided we just can't use this. And so we never actually. It seemed, and there was another clip that people online were speculating also came from either Jen or Stephanie talking about Jay. So some woman was interviewed about them and said these things, but we never heard who it was. And I think it's really the legal aspect is why they decided we just don't have enough to back this up. We can't accuse a private citizen of murder, and so we just can't say anything about this. What do you think of that?
I think that might have some plausibility if the person refused to allow their name to be used. Because, I mean, I think that the implications of allowing an anonymous person to accuse somebody of murder who's never been convicted of anything would probably be different than the implications of letting a named person say that. Because if someone is saying, I am telling you, I'm speaking my truth, I'm telling you that whoever it was stood before me and threatened me and said what happened to Hay could happen to you. Right. I don't think you could be libeled. I mean, this is not rumors. This is a first person account.
Right, so it's the equivalent of the New York Times reporting that someone said something, but they put in their voice, so then if the person they're talking about gets pissed off, they can't go after the New York Times because they're just reporting what someone said.
Right.
But doing it anonymously, obviously, is somewhat different and possibly is different legally.
I don't know about the law in Maryland or really very much about libel laws in general, but I think journalistically, I would be way more comfortable just putting a named accuser's first-person account of whatever it was they wanted to say. I mean, provided I had some assurance that they were in a position to have experienced this. I mean, maybe they did date the person. Maybe they were alone with this person. Maybe other people can confirm other things about it that would make this a plausible thing to say. But I would be sort of the problem with using anonymous sources is you're putting all the risk onto yourself and taking it all off the other person, which gives you the responsibility and them the freedom to not tell the truth.
Right, and then if the person being interviewed was Jen or Stephanie, it wouldn't be very hard to figure out because of the things they said who it actually was. So keeping anonymity in that respect would be very difficult.
But I also feel, has anybody who's connected to Woodlawn back in the day spoken out? I mean, Saad or anybody who would have known what Stephanie's voice sounded like. Saad is Rabia's co-activist, and he did a Reddit Ask Me Anything. And there are other people who were close friends with those guys, with that crew back in the day, who they talked to. I mean, has anybody been online saying, "I recognize that voice. I don't recognize that voice"?
I haven't delved in as deeply to the Reddit world as you have. I didn't see anything like that. Of course, it's very possible that the clip they did play was the voice was digitally changed in some way because they played other clips that are digitally changed, and they didn't sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks kind of thing, or the things they used to do on 2020, where you'd have the silhouette of someone's face and talking in a very distorted way. So it's possible that clip was that the person only agreed to do an on-air interview if their voice was changed, and their voice was changed, and so no one could recognize it anyway.
It's true, but then it sort of leads us back to the question of why they felt it was okay to run with this in the first place.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, if it was just an anonymous, and I think they could have been transparent about that too. It's like, well, this was an interview with someone who and we didn't feel comfortable running this.
Yeah.
Without.
Yeah, I think they should have said something about it. That's basically the only substantive critique I think of that stands up to the podcast is that aspect of it. There is one other thing I wanted to hit, which is this idea that from the last episode that Dana, the producer, aired, who was Sarah Koenig presented her as the ultimate skeptic, and she was saying basically she gave a narrative of if Adnan is innocent, boy, he's really unlucky. How unlucky is it that he lent his car and his phone, to this guy who was involved in a crime and he didn't have anything to do with it? How unlucky is it that he can't account for where he was these times? Because all those things have really happened. Boy, that would be really unlucky. So that's how she puts it. But it made me think, anytime kind of something randomly bad like happens to someone, you can draw a whole chain of things where if one thing didn't happen,
the whole thing wouldn't have happened.
The bad thing would have happened.
I mean, if Dawn had given Hay the excuse that she wanted to skip school and go hang out with him that day,
right. And we talked last time about how the first trial ended in a mistrial based on this very small thing, and it shows the randomness of life, and it's kind of frightening when you think about it. But there's all these stories about people who on 9/11 were supposed to be in the World Trade Center, but they had a dentist appointment, or they decided to walk their kid to work.
Yeah.
Life is random, and you can just put a narrative out. Let's say you get in a really bad car accident, and it was because you were speeding, and you were speeding because you were late for work, and you were late for work because you put the coffee on and it boiled over, and you put the coffee on because your automatic coffee maker broke, and your automatic coffee, and you didn't, and because you were going to take it to the store to get fixed last Tuesday, but you didn't because your mom called you.
Yeah.
So if any of those things hadn't happened, you wouldn't have gotten in a car accident.
Right.
And it's just crazy to think that way. So
And
it
I
is
mean,
very
yeah, I mean,
possible that
it could be-
Adnan is very, very unlucky. And if any of these things hadn't happened, then he'd have an obvious alibi.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have trouble believing that if he's innocent, he's really unlucky.
Right.
But I just don't think that's really a very appealing style of argument. It's like every hand that you're dealt in a poker game is pretty much equally unlikely. Certain patterns
Right.
are rewarded or meaningful, but any random hand as opposed to any other hand is also unlucky. I mean, it's unlikely, not unlucky.
Right, but we do hear stories of people who are exonerated, and it's just they are unlucky.
Yeah.
There's 6 billion
it's
people in the world, and a lot of things happen every day, and it's not crazy to think that Adnan was very, very unlucky. I don't think
No,
that's
I don't
to
really
really
think
suspend
that's crazy
disbelief
either.
to think that. Okay. So why don't we move on to kind of talking about. I want to ask you, what do you think? Where should the show go from here? So they did a fundraising appeal, and they are going to do a season 2. What do you think they should do for season 2?
Well, I want more true crime, but that's just my bias.
Oh, really? I was thinking the opposite, but why don't you say? I mean, so basically, my question is, they found this story that was very, very unusual and very compelling. There's not a ton of stories like that out there. Should they do another true crime, or should they do something completely different?
I mean, whatever their passion is, I'm sure it's going to be entertaining and good journalism. So I'll be happy
Right.
to see whatever they come up with. But I just happen to love true crime, and I feel like they weren't crime reporters when they started, but they've learned a lot in the interim and done all
Yeah.
kinds of amazing things. And they've probably changed their perspective on the justice system, and they've probably learned a lot about how the justice system works. And there are literally millions of fans out there who might be sending them tips. So if anybody's in a position to find the next case like this, it's going to be Sarah
That's a great
Koenig.
point. That's a great point. That this case fell in their lap basically, and now there's a million people out there who might think, I have another story that you should do. But I was joking with my wife that season 2 should be about dock workers in Baltimore. But I think something I was thinking, like, they should just do a totally different story, something like just following like what was happening at like a factory or like what was happening at a school. And instead of a mystery story, just do a completely different genre and see if it would work. I just think that'd be really interesting.
I mean, This American Life
change
did
it up
really
completely.
well with the Harper High School, sort of following them for a year and condensing it into a shorter broadcast.
Yeah. So that's a famous series. I think it was a 2-parter that This American Life did, following inner city high school in Chicago, I believe, and kind of just telling people stories, and which is what This American Life is really excels at. So yeah, so while I agree that true crime is fascinating, I'm kind of hoping for something completely different. And I think that's kind of more likely because I feel like if they do another true crime, they're not going to be able to top this. There's not going to be another case that has so much uncertainty. So I think they're just going to try something totally different, and I'm sure it will be good because they really did a good job. Something else I wanted to mention. So I was joking. So people not in the know, I was joking about the dock workers. So this show is similar to The Wire in a lot of ways. The obvious one is that they both take place in Baltimore County, and they both involve crime. But the other thing that is kind of interesting, and so season 1 of The Wire was a story about a drug gang, and season 2 of The Wire kind of really changed the story up completely, and it was about dock workers, and there was a drug angle still, but it was really about globalization and these guys who used to be, the job used to be for really strong guys to tote like huge barrels around all day, and now these same guys are like working on computer terminals at the docks, and it takes a lot fewer people. So and that's a lot of people think that's kind of the weakest season of the show.
I think it's the strongest season of the show.
Oh, really?
I love it.
Okay. Probably a lot of people think season 5
When
is
I got a
the
chance
season of the show.
to meet David Simon and have him sign one of my box sets for The Wire, it was the season 2 box set that I brought with me.
Oh, wow, that's cool. So actually, my father was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, so I have a Baltimore connection. But anyway, so season 2 would be if I had to rank The Wire seasons, which is a parlor game that fans of The Wire play sometimes. I would rank season 2 as the second worst season. But anyway, so they did something completely different. And that's what I was saying before, that Serial should try something completely different. But anyway, I think the interesting comparison to The Wire goes beyond just the Baltimore and the crime aspect. I think the thing that makes The Wire great is it's not just a great cops and robbers show. It's about like how the system fails, and that's really hard to illustrate through a story about people. You can read some dry academic tome about like how the justice system fails, how the education system fails, but to tell a story with real people in terms of Serial, fictional people in terms of The Wire, and make it about how systems fail.
Yeah, with Serial, this is one criticism that I always get really frustrated with, are the people that say, Serial this season should have focused more on corruption in the Baltimore Police Department. And what I keep wanting to say to these people is, they investigated. They told us all the shady stuff that they saw. I'm sure they're not holding out on us. If they had, a confession from Detective McGillivray or something like that,
right.
They would have told us, but I think they just weren't able to find the out-and-out corruption that people were looking for.
Right, and the thing is, like, they talked to people, experts in criminal law and in prosecuting cases, and they kind of said, like, yeah, they did it pretty well. Like, the things worked about as well as they usually work, yet still there was this miscarriage of justice. Whether or not you think Adnan is guilty, you have to say...
systemic critique going. Like, the police don't know how to interview people to get real information. They know how to interview people to confirm the hypotheses they already have.
Right. So, yeah. So, exactly.
So, I mean, that is a systemic critique. And many of the same people who make the argument, why didn't they expose the corruption, seem to be missing the fact that there are some very deep systemic critiques about the entire criminal justice system, not just in Baltimore, but in all of law enforcement and in all of, there was a really great story that came as an op-ed by public defender who said, we need to change the process for sharing evidence in these cases because we barely get to see anything that the state has. The state has to decide whether it's exculpatory evidence. And of course, the very people who are fighting you in court. That was a piece in the Washington
Post?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll link to that piece below. That was interesting. I agree. But that one was also kind of critiquing Serial. But I think if you listen to it, obviously week to week you were trying to figure out what actually happened. But if you kind of sit back and think about it, there was a very cogent, deep, systemic critique of how the justice system works, and it's hard to not deny the fact that justice. If you think Adnan is guilty, then justice was done in a very rough way and not how we would want it to be done.
Well, I don't think justice was done. I mean, if you put somebody in jail, you have to put them there for good reasons. I think he did it, but I don't think justice was done. Like, you can't just put people in jail because you think that's the most likely explanation for what happened.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one half of the political spectrum is committed to the idea that, that these things don't matter at all, and if someone is a terrorism suspect, then, they're guilty automatically. So there are people out there who believe that the presumption of innocence really doesn't apply to some people, particularly Muslims. It's kind of coincidental in this case that, maybe not exactly coincidental, that the central figure is Muslim. But these are live issues, and even if we think everyone deserves their day in court, presumption of innocence, you read some internet comments on an article about the CIA torture report, and you see that a large number of Americans don't actually believe that.
Yeah, also, and I think getting back to the torture report and its implications, the CIA was never able to say they got anything useful out of that. And you think, even if you're the most pro-law and order, tracking down terrorists, whatever, the fact is, if you don't ask people questions in a rigorous and systematic way, you won't get good answers. I mean, torture is nothing if not a system for confirming your own biases. And you think about how much evidence we may have lost forever, how many terrorist conspiracies were never uncovered because they didn't interview. They interviewed in a way to confirm their own biases instead of to expand their understanding of the phenomenon before them. And they hurt a lot of people who were innocent, and a lot of people they had no right to hurt even if they were guilty on top of all that. But I mean, I think that there's a really direct parallel to what Serial has to say about using rigorous truth-finding methods to get stories instead of just using your power to coerce people into confirming what you already believe, because you won't get the truth.
Right. I think that's right on. And I mean, another parallel with the torture report is, we discussed last time how, there's some blatant anti-Muslim sentiment that the prosecutor played to, but I'm sure that prosecutor would not consider themselves Islamophobic or anti-Muslim, that prosecutor would consider themselves someone who is pursuing justice. And I'm sure most of the people at the CIA, now I believe Dick Cheney is an evil person, but I believe that most of the people at the CIA...
I don't know that he's Islamophobic. I think he's just evil and authoritarian. Even he may not have specific bias.
Oh, yeah, I don't think Dick Cheney is probably not specifically Islamophobic.
Not that I want to go out of my way to say anything nice about Dick Cheney. He may very well be Islamophobic, but I just don't know.
Right, but the vast majority of people, I mean, I would say the majority of the people who are involved in the CIA interrogation program were not sadists. They were not evil. They thought they were doing the right thing, and most of the people who do awful things in this world, especially people who are empowered by a government, they think they're doing the right thing.
I don't know. Some of the backgrounds of the CIA, the people who actually carried out the torture, I mean, there's such a thing as motivated reasoning. If you are a sadist, it's probably easier to convince yourself that torturing people is the right thing to do.
That's true. But there was an interview in the Times with one of these psychologists who somehow bilked the government out of $80 million for their consulting services. This guy thought he was helping. Most of the people at the CIA honestly thought that they were helping prevent another 9/11, which the most catastrophic attack on American soil. So most of them were basically good people, I would say, and I'm sure they think that they are good people, and yet they still committed crimes. They committed war crimes, but they did it because a systemic failure. And I
mean, Abu Ghraib.
People want to say this person was. People want to say this person was a villain. Everything about them is wrong. We only need good people. We just need to kick out the bums and kick out the evil people. But the system rewards people who are, most people aren't really super great or super awful. They're just kind of somewhere in the middle. And when the system is set up in such a way that people who are more or less average are able to commit war crimes, that's a huge problem. And just saying a few bad apples, that kind of thing, it isn't gonna solve the problem.
No.
Okay, so we've kind of gotten a little bit off of what Serial is. So I guess, is there anything else you want to discuss in general about Serial, about the last episode?
I think that about covers it.
Okay, so the one final question that I kind of half answered already is, for someone who really likes Serial, what else would you recommend? A book, a movie, a piece of journalism. What else would you recommend? My recommendation would be The Wire, for reasons I already stated. Anything else you would recommend?
I think the series The Staircase, which I believe was on, I forget which cable network, but you can buy it on Amazon for $13, and it's a 6-hour series about this guy Peterson, who was accused of bludgeoning his wife to death, and he maintains that she fell down a staircase and died. And it's by the same guy who did Death on a Sunday Morning, French documentarian whose name escapes me, and people have been talking a lot about the Death on a Sunday Morning one, which is also good, and I think possibly on Netflix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard other recommendations to that.
My favorite.
I'll definitely check that one out.
I would always want to turn people towards Fatal Vision. It's old Joe McGinnis's investigation of Jeffrey MacDonald, which was the inspiration for Janet Malcolm's The Journalist and the Murderer, which is also a very good book. So reading them together is a really interesting and instructive exercise. But I think McGinnis never really got as much credit as he should for what a brilliant work of true crime that was. And I think Serial fans will find it interesting because of his storytelling techniques and the way that he builds the story over time and reveals things selectively to create a satisfying narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have not read or seen any of those. Those are great recommendations. It's kind of funny that this is basically a podcast talking about podcast, and The Journalist and the Murderer is a book about another book. So there's a lot of meta considerations in here. Just the other thing, a lot of other people have mentioned this. The Thin Blue Line, the Errol Morris documentary, is kind of
very
one
good.
of the original forms of this kind of going back over a crime very minutely. And as long as we're talking about Errol Morris and facts and fiction, and of course things that happened after 9/11, maybe my favorite documentary of all time is Errol Morris's The Fog of War.
It's a very good one.
Yeah, that's just an amazing documentary. So I would which is about Robert McNamara.
And also Standard Operating Procedure, which is about the torture at Abu Ghraib, and has these very intimate interviews with some of the torturers.
Right, and again, a lot of these you have some people who are sadists or psychopaths or something end up in these positions, but most of them are just more or less regular people who, because of the situation they're put in, act in really horrible ways. So is there? I think we've about reached the end of our time. Lindsay, thank you so much for talking about Serial. Serial season 1 is over. Maybe we can have you back on sometime talking about something else, or maybe Serial season 2.
I would love that. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks to our viewers, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care.
Bye.